The air was thick with dust and silence. Deep inside an abandoned mine shaft, a dim beam of light caught the glint of rusted metal. An old delivery wagon, wedged into the earth as if swallowed by time itself. Investigators froze, their boots scraping against stone, realizing they weren't looking at relics of hard labor. This wagon had no business being here. It belonged to the Vault family, the very same wagon that vanished along with Iva and Elizabeth nearly a decade earlier. If you are new to this channel, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, like this video, and comment where you are watching from. And with that discovery, the story of the Vault sisters was rewritten forever. California, 1995. The kind of summer that paints a valley gold with sunlight, where the days seem endless and the nights echo with crickets. For most families, it was just another season. But for the Vault family, it would be remembered as the summer their world was torn apart. The valley was quiet, almost timeless, tucked away from the sprawl of modern California. This wasn't the California of freeways, neon lights, and endless traffic. This was a secluded Amish settlement, where life moved at the pace of a horse's trot. Electricity wasn't part of the world here. Neither were telephones, televisions, or radios. The community thrived on faith, hard work, and tradition. 17-year-old Iva Vault had grown into a picture of quiet responsibility. She was tall for her age, her dark hair tucked neatly beneath her prayer covering. She carried herself with the kind of maturity expected of the eldest daughter. 15-year-old Elizabeth, younger by 2 years, was her mirror in some ways, but with more spark in her eyes, a little more laughter that slipped out when the elders weren't looking. Together they balanced one another. Iva, steady and serious, Elizabeth, curious and restless. On that summer afternoon, the girls were tasked with something simple. Hitch the family horse to the delivery wagon and carry out an errand for their parents. The wagon itself wasn't remarkable, wooden, sturdy, worn down by years of use. But to the Vault family it was essential. It carried produce, goods, and sometimes even neighbors. It was part of their lives, part of their rhythm. Witnesses recalled seeing the sisters wave goodbye as they set out, the horses' hooves clipping against the dirt road, the wheels creaking as they rounded the bend. It was an ordinary scene. Too ordinary. No one in that valley could have guessed those waves were final goodbyes. When the sun dipped and the shadows stretched long across the valley, the Vaults expected to see their daughters return. But night fell and the road remained empty. The lanterns burned late into the evening, swinging from porches as fathers scanned the darkness, listening for hoofbeats that never came. By midnight, unease set in. By dawn, panic replaced it. In one night, 2 sisters had vanished. No sounds of a struggle. No broken traces of a path. No footprints, no overturned wagon, no horse. Just silence. The kind of silence that feels like it's hiding something. The Amish community rallied, their way of life built on unity. Men rode the roads, checked barns, combed the valley floor. Women prayed in small circles, clutching their shawls, whispering hope into the night. But as the hours stretched into days, hope began to fracture. Where had the Vault sisters gone? The first theory seemed to fall from lips almost too easily. They must have run away. Outside investigators leaned into it. To them the logic was simple. 2 teenage girls, raised in strict religious rules, must have grown tired of the endless boundaries. No music. No modern clothes. No driving. No choices. Maybe they saw the English world, that is, the outside modern world, as an escape. Detectives noted the timing. 17 and 15. The ages where girls begin to dream bigger, where curiosity can clash with control. The runaway narrative had weight, at least on paper. But inside the valley the whispers were different. Neighbors shook their heads, their voices hushed. Iva? Running away? Impossible. She was the kind of daughter who obeyed without question, the kind who worked quietly beside her mother and carried responsibility like it was second nature. Elizabeth, perhaps she had more spark, but she was still bound by faith, by loyalty to her family. Their parents insisted the same. Our daughters did not run away. Still, the story caught fire outside the community. Newspapers latched onto it, painting the disappearance as a classic tale of rebellion. 2 girls seduced by the promise of freedom. Headlines sold the idea that maybe the Vault sisters had slipped into a new life somewhere in the sprawl of California cities. Maybe they were waitressing under false names. Maybe they were with boyfriends their parents never knew about. Maybe they were finally free. But this explanation carried cracks. Deep cracks. For one, the sisters had left with nothing. No spare clothes, no money, not even a note. If they'd planned to run, wouldn't they have prepared? And where was the wagon? Where was the horse? Even runaways don't vanish into thin air. The runaway theory, it was a convenient story. It silenced questions. It kept people from looking too hard. But for the Vault family it was a dagger. Because believing their daughters had run meant believing they'd been abandoned. And that was something the parents refused to accept. For months the case stood still. The sheriff's office conducted searches but found no trail. The fields gave nothing. The roads nothing. And every day that passed made the runaway story seem more believable to outsiders, and more unbearable to those who knew the sisters best. By the end of that first year, whispers turned into acceptance. Even without evidence, the narrative hardened like cement. Iva and Elizabeth had simply chosen a different life. But those who really knew them held on to unease. Something wasn't right. Their departure didn't fit. Their silence didn't make sense. And the empty road that stretched out of the valley, it felt less like a choice and more like an abduction. And so, for 9 long years, the story of the Vault sisters was one of rebellion and escape. But when the truth finally clawed its way out of the earth, it revealed something far darker. Something that proved the sisters hadn't left by choice, but by force. In the beginning there was still hope. Hope that Iva and Elizabeth would appear on the horizon one morning, Wagon rattling behind them, smiling sheepishly as though the whole valley had worried for nothing. But as days turned to weeks, and weeks to months, hope began to dissolve into something heavier. The first summer without the sisters was suffocating. The Vault family lived with unanswered questions, their home carrying the weight of absence. Iva's chores went undone. Elizabeth's laughter, once ringing through the house, was missing. Their mother admitted she still set 2 extra places at the table for months, unable to accept their absence. The wider Amish community kept their lanterns burning at night. Men scoured the valley again and again, checking fence lines, scouring old barns, peering into creeks. But each search ended the same way, silence. The sheriff's office conducted interviews but nothing stuck. There were no signs of strangers in the valley. No suspicious tracks. No disturbances. Without leads the investigation began to cool. And yet, the mystery only deepened. How does a wagon, an entire wagon, and a horse vanish without leaving so much as a trail? By the end of that first year the official line had hardened. The Vault sisters had run away. The story spread outside the valley, carried by newspapers that found the tale irresistible. 2 Amish girls, lured by the modern world, escaping tradition. It was a narrative that sold papers and filled airtime. But while the outside world consumed the runaway story, the family endured the sting of whispered judgment. Neighbors quietly wondered, had the parents been too strict? Had the sisters grown resentful? The Vaults rejected the insinuation, clinging to the certainty that their daughters would never abandon them. But certainty can't compete with time. As 1 year turned to 2, then 3, the girls' absence began to feel permanent. Life in the valley moved forward as life cruelly does. Babies were born, couples married, elders passed away. But for the Vault family, time stopped in 1995. Every milestone reminded them of what was missing. By the 5th year, searches had ceased. The sheriff's office officially filed the case as presumed runaway. To the public, the story was closed. But to those who loved Iva and Elizabeth, it was a wound that refused to heal. And then came 2004. 9 years after the wagon had rattled out of the valley, an ordinary inspection in the foothills would turn a cold case into something far darker. Because the truth wasn't buried in the past, it was buried underground. The Sierra Nevada foothills stretched like a jagged scar across California, filled with secrets. Old gold mines pocked the land, shafts carved deep into the rock during the frenzy of the 1800s. Most had been abandoned, left to collapse in silence. But in 2004, state environmental workers were tasked with surveying these forgotten mines, sealing off the most dangerous ones before curious hikers, or children, fell victim to their dark depths. It was routine work. Log the shaft, measure the depth, mark it for closure. But one mine, one hidden beneath brush and time, was about to turn routine into revelation. The team lowered themselves cautiously into the shaft. The air grew colder as they descended, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Dust clung to their clothes. For several minutes, it was nothing but rock, dirt, and silence. Then the beam of a flashlight caught something unnatural. Not stone. Not soil. What? Metal. The workers froze. Lodged deep within the shaft, wedged at an impossible angle, was the skeleton of a wagon. Its frame had splintered with age, its wheels twisted and half buried in rubble. Rust clung to its fittings, but its shape was unmistakable. This wasn't mining equipment. This wasn't debris from the gold rush. This was the Vault family's delivery wagon. For 9 years, the accepted truth had been that Iva and Elizabeth Vault ran away. But wagons don't run away. Wagons don't drive themselves into mine shafts. This discovery shattered the runaway theory in an instant. The find was reported immediately. Detectives, long resigned to a cold case, rushed to the site. They climbed into the shaft themselves, eyes tracing every detail. The wagon's frame bore marks of violence. A hard drop, perhaps, or a deliberate push. The horse was nowhere to be found, only fragments of leather harness tangled among the debris. What chilled investigators most wasn't what they found, but what they didn't. No bodies. The wagon had been recovered. The evidence of foul play was undeniable. But the sisters themselves were gone. The discovery flipped the story on its head. The Vault sisters had not abandoned their family. They hadn't slipped quietly into a new life. Something violent had torn them from the valley and dragged them to this remote, hidden shaft. The wagon proved the end of the runaway theory. But it also opened a darker question. If this is where their journey ended, then where were the girls? The investigation reignited like wildfire. The sheriff's office combed through the area, expanding searches beyond the shaft. Dogs were brought in. Forensic teams scoured the wagon for fingerprints, fibers, any trace of DNA. But after nearly a decade, time had erased most clues. To the family, the discovery was both vindication and devastation. Their daughters hadn't abandoned them, that much was certain. But the truth was far worse. Instead of a quiet escape, there had been violence. And yet, the bodies were missing. Had the sisters been taken deeper into the mines? Were they buried somewhere in the foothills? Or had someone moved them after hiding the wagon? Every mystery has a turning point. For the Vault sisters, it was the moment their wagon was dragged out of the earth. But what lay ahead wasn't clarity. It was a descent into suspicion, division, and secrets. And the mine shaft was only the beginning. Imagine standing in the dark belly of the earth, your flashlight catching the ghost of wood splintered and rusted, a wagon buried where no wagon should ever be. That was the moment when the mystery of the Vault sisters turned from speculation to horror. The workers who stumbled upon the wagon in 2004 knew instantly this wasn't just debris. When detectives arrived, they confirmed it. The warped remains matched the description of the Vault family's delivery wagon, the same one that had disappeared with Iva and Elizabeth 9 years earlier. The shaft was tight, claustrophobic, the air heavy with dust. Investigators crouched low, hands brushing over the broken frame. Rust clung to the iron fittings. The wooden planks cracked at a touch, as if the years had gnawed them hollow. But it was the position of the wagon that raised the first chilling questions. It wasn't sitting flat at the bottom. It was wedged, awkwardly angled against stone, as if shoved down with force. The wheels bore marks of violent impact. The harness straps were torn. There was no trace of the horse, no bones, no remains, only a few weathered strips of leather. The discovery wasn't just shocking, it was damning. Wagons don't drive themselves into mine shafts. Horses don't vanish without a trace. This was no runaway. This was a crime scene. The sheriff's office wasted no time reopening the case. Forensic teams documented every inch. Soil samples were collected, photographs snapped. A crane was eventually brought in to hoist the fragile remains out of the shaft, the wood creaking like a coffin being lifted from the ground. The wagon told a story, but an incomplete one. It confirmed violence. It confirmed foul play. But what it didn't confirm was the fate of the sisters. No clothing. No bones. No signs of a struggle left inside the shaft. Just the silent shell of a wagon. For the Vault family, the discovery was a knife that cut both ways. For 9 years, they had lived under the shadow of whispers, judged by outsiders who believed their daughters had abandoned them. The wagon silenced those whispers forever. Their daughters hadn't chosen to leave. They had been taken. But vindication came hand in hand with devastation. Because if the wagon had been hidden here, what had become of Iva and Elizabeth? The runaway theory was gone. But in its place rose a darker, more sinister question. If the wagon was buried in the earth, where were the girls? For the Vaults, the discovery reopened every wound they had tried to stitch closed. Their daughters' names flooded back into headlines, but this time the story wasn't about teenage rebellion, it was about abduction, about murder. In the Amish community, the news spread like wildfire. Families who once believed the girls had run began to murmur apologies, sorrow etched in their faces. The discovery shifted the narrative overnight, but it didn't bring comfort. It brought fear. If 2 daughters could vanish without a trace, hidden for years beneath the foothills, what did that say about the safety of the valley itself? The Vault home became a place of mourning all over again. Their mother, who had prayed daily for her daughter's safe return, now faced the devastating certainty that safety had never been possible. Their father, once stoic, was said to have wept openly after the discovery, grief breaking through the wall of silence he'd built for nearly a decade. Neighbors remembered how the family kept their curtains drawn in those first weeks after the news. Some said they could hear the mother's cries drifting through the still night air. Others said the father walked the fields alone, lantern in hand, as though still searching in the dark. The wagon was proof. Proof of violence. Proof of foul play. But proof without answers is its own kind of torment. Because knowing what happened to the wagon only made the question of the sisters' fate more unbearable. Detectives promised the family they would pursue every lead. The sheriff's office was suddenly back under the weight of a case they had shelved for nearly a decade. Witnesses from 1995 were re-interviewed. Old files were dragged from archives. Suspects, some long forgotten, were re-examined. But time is the enemy of justice. 9 years had eroded evidence. Memories had blurred. Potential suspects had moved away, or passed away. Every lead seemed to circle back into dead ends. Meanwhile, the Vault family clung to their faith, but faith doesn't erase grief. They buried themselves in prayer and community, but the silence of their daughter's absence rang louder than hymns. For Elizabeth's childhood friend, the discovery was the breaking point. She had always rejected the runaway story, but now with the wagon found, she confessed to investigators a secret she had kept. Weeks before their disappearance, Elizabeth had confided that she sometimes felt watched when traveling the roads. She hadn't said by who. She hadn't given details. Just a feeling of unease. Investigators seized on the account, but without names or evidence, it remained a thread too thin to hold. Still, for the family, it confirmed what they already feared. Someone had been watching, waiting, planning. The wagon's discovery ended one story, but it also began another. No longer were the Vault sisters painted as rebels who abandoned their roots. They were victims of something darker, something calculated. And while their family grieved anew, the rest of the valley began to look over their shoulders, wondering who had been hiding among them all along. The grief of the family transformed into a new kind of torment, uncertainty. Because now, the Vaults were forced to reckon with two unbearable truths. Truth 1, their daughters hadn't left them. Truth 2, someone had taken them. And yet, the earth had yielded only the wagon, not the sisters. In mysteries like these, answers rarely come clean. The wagon had been found. But the girls were still missing. And that absence haunted not just a family, not just a community, but an entire state. Because if this is where their journey ended, why were their bodies not there? And who had buried the truth so deep for so long? When the wagon was dragged out of that mine shaft in 2004, the case of the Vault sisters transformed overnight. What had once been dismissed as a runaway story was now a confirmed crime. And for the sheriff's office, there was no choice left but to reopen an investigation they had long buried. Detectives began with the old files. Boxes of reports, witness statements, maps of the valley, everything was pulled out of storage. Dusty evidence folders were spread across desks. The names of people once questioned in 1995 were written on fresh white boards. It was as if the clock had rewound, but the hands still ticked forward with urgency. The first challenge was obvious. 9 years had passed. Witnesses had grown older. Memories had blurred. Some had moved away while others had died. Even physical evidence, tire marks, footprints, possible objects at the scene, had long since vanished into the soil. Still, detectives pressed forward. They re-interviewed the Vault family, walking them through those final days again. The father repeated the same detail he'd given years ago. His daughters had been happy, dutiful. They had no reason to leave. The mother, with tears in her eyes, told investigators once again about the food waiting on the stove that evening, untouched when the girls never came home. Then came the neighbors. Some insisted they had seen nothing unusual that day. Others admitted they remembered hearing a wagon late in the evening, though they couldn't say if it belonged to the Vaults. One elderly man recalled seeing a stranger's truck near the foothills around the time of the disappearance, but after 9 years, even he couldn't be certain if memory was playing tricks. The investigation felt like chasing shadows. For every lead resurrected, another crumbled under the weight of time. But the discovery of the wagon reignited public interest. News stations flocked to the valley, cameras rolling as reporters stood near the mine shaft, broadcasting live. For the first time in nearly a decade, the names Iva and Elizabeth Vault were on everyone's lips again. Public pressure grew. Families wanted answers. The Vaults demanded justice. And detectives knew they had to deliver something more than theories. They combed through crime databases checking for similar abductions. They interviewed convicted offenders in nearby counties, probing for connections. Some names were promising. Some suspects even admitted to traveling near the valley in the 1990s. But without physical evidence, every interview ended in frustration. Still, the wagon was undeniable proof. And for investigators, that meant one thing. Whoever was responsible hadn't simply hidden the girls. They had staged something. They had chosen that shaft deliberately. This wasn't random. This was planned. And if it was planned, then the person who did it knew this valley. They knew the sisters' route. They knew where to hide a secret, deep enough to last 9 years. And yet, even with that revelation, detectives were left with the same gnawing question the family had carried for nearly a decade. Where were the sisters? With no bodies recovered, the vacuum filled quickly, with theories, rumors, and suspicions that spread like wildfire. Some believed the sisters had been ambushed during their errand. A predator could have been waiting on the road, forcing them off course before driving the wagon into the shaft to cover their tracks. But if so, why were there no witnesses, no sounds of a struggle? Others argued it had to be someone from inside the valley. The mine shaft was remote, overgrown, not the kind of place an outsider would stumble upon. Whoever had hidden the wagon there had chosen carefully, perhaps knowing the area since childhood. That pointed to someone local. Someone trusted. The whispers grew darker. Could it have been a member of their own community? A man with twisted intentions hiding behind the mask of faith? Or perhaps a bitter feud gone too far? The possibility that the killer was not a stranger, but someone the sisters knew, unsettled the valley to its core. Law enforcement followed every thread. They looked at men with criminal histories in nearby towns. They considered known predators operating in California during the mid-90s. But they also quietly questioned members of the Amish community itself. Could someone within the circle of trust have betrayed it in the most violent way? The runaway narrative, once dominant, had now been completely replaced by darker possibilities. If they hadn't chosen to leave, then someone had chosen for them. As theories multiplied, so did fear. Mothers refused to let their daughters travel alone. Families began locking doors that had never been locked before. The valley, once a sanctuary of faith and simplicity, was fractured by suspicion. Meanwhile, journalists sensationalized every possibility. Headlines screamed about Amish secrets and murder in the valley. Some reporters painted lurid pictures of hidden sins, scandals, and forbidden desires. For the Vault family, these articles were unbearable. Their daughters had become characters in a story they had no control over. And still, no bodies. Every theory circled back to the same chilling truth. The wagon was found, but the sisters were not. And in that absence, every possibility became plausible. Ambush, betrayal, murder, cover-up. Theories only fueled more questions. If it was an ambush, why leave the wagon in a mine shaft where it could one day be found? If it was someone local, how had they kept the secret so long? And most chilling of all, if the sisters were dead, why hadn't their bodies surfaced? Some dared to whisper an even darker thought. What if they weren't dead at all? What if they had been taken and forced into lives hidden from their family forever? Narrator, voice soft, deliberate, almost haunting. Theories multiplied, but answers remained buried. And as the valley tore itself apart with suspicion, one truth became clearer than ever. Whoever had taken Iva and Elizabeth had succeeded not only in hiding their crime, but in infecting an entire community with doubt and fear. The case had gone from a closed file to a storm of speculation. And for detectives, that storm made it harder to see the truth. But one fact, simple and undeniable, stood tall above the noise. The wagon had been found. The sisters had not. In the wake of the wagon's discovery, the valley was no longer the same. What had once been a sanctuary of faith and trust became a landscape scarred by suspicion. Everyone wanted answers, but no one wanted to believe the truth might live among them. The Amish community, normally united in faith and tradition, began to splinter under the pressure of rumor. Some insisted the crime had been the work of an outsider, a predator who slipped into the valley, lured the sisters away, and vanished into the foothills. To them, it was the only explanation that preserved the purity of their community. But others whispered differently. The mine shaft wasn't random. It wasn't a place an outsider would know. Whoever chose it had known the land intimately. That pointed to someone from inside the valley, someone trusted, someone close. And that possibility planted a poison. Neighbors who once broke bread together now eyed one another with quiet suspicion. Fathers who had shared wagons to market stopped speaking. Mothers pulled their children closer. The nightly gatherings, once filled with warmth and prayer, became thin, strained, haunted by what was unsaid. The very silence that bound the Amish together now became the silence that tore them apart. The sheriff's office, sensing the tension, pressed harder into the possibility of an insider. They interviewed members of the community again, but Amish tradition is built on separation from the outside world, and many resisted. Their distrust of law enforcement only deepened the mystery. Some gave short answers. Others refused to speak at all. And so suspicion festered. If not a stranger, then who? Some pointed fingers toward men with reputations for temper or secrecy. Others wondered about quiet grudges, buried conflicts between families. Theories crept from house to house, each more chilling than the last. At the same time, outsiders, journalists and tourists drawn by the headlines, descended on the valley, poking cameras into places that had once been private. Reporters speculated openly about abuse, cover-ups, and dark secrets hidden behind barn doors. For the community, it was humiliation piled on grief. Their tragedy had become entertainment for the outside world. For the Vault family, the division cut deeper than ever. They had once believed their neighbors stood with them in faith. Now they watched as whispers clouded every corner. The family kept largely to themselves, retreating further into grief, aware that even pity could feel like suspicion. The valley had lost not only 2 daughters, it had lost its trust. And when trust dies, fear takes its place. By the end of that year, one truth was undeniable. The Vault sisters had left their valley united. But in their absence, they had left behind a community divided, fractured by silence, haunted by questions, and poisoned by the possibility that the answer lay uncomfortably close to home. If the discovery of the wagon had been a spark, what followed was a long, slow burn. Despite renewed investigations, the months after 2004 yielded nothing concrete. No bodies, no weapons, no confessions, just silence. Search teams combed the foothills, focusing on other abandoned shafts. Dogs sniffed at the dirt, handlers praying for a sign. Excavators probed deeper. But the land refused to give up its secrets. It was as though the earth itself had conspired to bury the truth. The silence of those foothills became its own character in the story, patient, unyielding, cruel. Investigators chased leads across California. Tips came in from people who swore they'd seen the sisters alive in cities like Sacramento or Fresno. But every sighting proved false, mirages fueled by rumor and hope. The sisters' faces had become so familiar from news reports that people imagined them in every stranger's shadow. The Vault family endured the torment of false hope. Each phone call from police stirred a flicker of possibility. Each disappointment cut the wound deeper. And while the investigation dragged on, the story of Iva and Elizabeth hardened into legend. Children who hadn't even been born in 1995 grew up hearing the warnings whispered by their mothers. Never walk alone. Don't stray from the road. Remember what happened to the Vault sisters. The mine shaft itself became a grim landmark. Teenagers dared one another to approach it at night. Journalists returned year after year, cameras lingering over the empty hole in the ground, using it as a visual symbol of unanswered questions. For the Amish, the silence was more than literal. Their culture values privacy, humility, and faith in God's plan. To them, speaking too freely about suspicions risked judgment, risked gossip. And so they did what they had always done in times of fear. They fell silent. But silence is a double-edged sword. What protects a community can also strangle it. That silence became the legacy of the Vault sisters. Not justice, not answers, but silence. Detectives knew the odds were against them. Cold cases rarely thaw. Without bodies, prosecutors had little to build a case upon. Every theory was speculation. Every rumor was smoke without fire. Still, they pressed on, knowing that closure mattered. But as years slipped by, the investigation stagnated once more, and the story of the Vault sisters began to fade from headlines again. For the family, however, it never faded. Their grief became a quiet routine, an empty place at the table, 2 bedrooms frozen in time, daily prayers whispered into the void. And yet, one detail from the wagon haunted them most. It was found without their daughters. That absence gnawed at the family, kept them awake at night. Because without bodies there could be no burial, no final goodbye, no closure. The wagon had been a coffin without its dead, proof of violence but denial of peace. And so the valley was left to live with silence, an echoing, suffocating silence that stretched from the foothills to the hearts of everyone who remembered Iva and Elizabeth. Nearly 3 decades have passed since the summer of 1995, and still the case of Iva and Elizabeth vault lingers in the air like smoke from a fire that never truly burned out. Despite the discovery of the wagon, despite countless hours of searching, the sisters themselves were never found. Their absence became the heart of the story. People could imagine almost anything, foul play, abduction, even darker conspiracies, but no one could prove anything. Detectives and journalists alike returned to the same central mystery. If the sisters' wagon ended at the bottom of a mine shaft, where were they? Some experts believed the sisters might have been separated from the wagon before it was forced into the shaft. Others theorized the bodies had been hidden elsewhere, deliberately removed to erase the truth. A more chilling suggestion was whispered, that the shaft may have originally held their remains, but someone returned later to move them, ensuring the truth would never be uncovered. Each theory answered one question, but left three more in its place. Families of missing children know a particular kind of torment, where closure is always just out of reach. The vaults lived this torment daily. Without evidence, every rumor carried weight. Without a body, every nightmare remained possible. Were their daughters killed quickly, spared prolonged suffering? Or had they endured something far worse? The community, too, remained trapped in the purgatory of questions. Silence had become survival, but beneath it, doubt never left. Did someone among them carry a secret? Did guilt live behind one of those quiet Amish doors? For outsiders, the mystery became obsession. True crime writers dissected the details. Paranormal enthusiasts claimed the sisters' spirits haunted the valley. Every few years, the story returned to local papers, always with the same haunting headline, "Still Missing." But behind the theories, behind the headlines, behind the noise of speculation, two truths stood firm. The wagon was real. The sisters were gone. And everything else was shadows. In the end, the unanswered questions were not just about what happened, but about who the Vault sisters might have been had they lived. What futures were stolen from them? What lives might they have led, if not for the darkness waiting in the foothills? The mystery had stolen not only two girls, but the very possibility of their tomorrow. As time pushed forward, the valley changed. New families arrived. Children grew up. The shadow of 1995 grew faint, but it never disappeared. The foothills still loomed, quiet and indifferent. The mine shaft still lay hidden beneath weeds and brush, scars in the earth that refused to close. And for those who remembered, the sisters' absence never faded. The Vault family continued their lives with dignity, but grief etched itself into everything. Holidays passed with chairs left empty. Birthdays became memorials. Their daughters' faces, once bright with innocence, were now forever frozen in photographs, reminders of what could have been. The silence of the community endured too. Whispers of guilt, whispers of fear, they still existed though rarely spoken aloud. Outsiders sometimes asked, why don't the Amish speak more openly? Why don't they demand answers? But for the Amish, demanding wasn't their way. They believed judgment would come from God, not from courts or headlines. And so the silence remained, both shield and prison. But silence does not erase memory. The Vault sisters became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even in places built on faith, darkness can still find its way in. For the outside world, the case remains unsolved. The wagon stands as both evidence and symbol, proof that something terrible happened but never enough to explain exactly what. Detectives still occasionally revisit the file, though the chances of answers grow smaller each year. Time, after all, is the enemy of cold cases. Memories fade. Witnesses die. Evidence erodes. And yet, the story refuses to let go. Because some mysteries don't close with time. They echo. They echo in the questions asked around dinner tables. They echo in the footsteps of teenagers daring each other near the shaft. They echo in the prayers of a family still waiting for an ending. The Vault sisters vanished into silence. And in that silence they remain. Not forgotten. Not at peace. Just gone. If you want more real-life stories that never got the ending they deserved, hit subscribe and leave a comment below. And to the Vault family, know this. We haven't forgotten Iva and Elizabeth. Their story still echoes, and until the silence is broken, we will keep telling it.